Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I didn't know a living room could feel like a courtroom until that night. There were balloons tied to the backs of chairs, paper lanterns glowing warm yellow, and the smell of cardamom and roasted meat drifting through the house like an invitation to relax. My parents had insisted we all come early, said it was a family celebration, one of those evenings where we pretended nothing was broken. I wore a blue dress I'd bought on sale, the one that made me feel put together even when I wasn't. I had rehearsed my smile in the car, practiced the calm nod I used when my mother asked why I still lived alone, why I worked so much, why I hadn't settled. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself family was family. I was wrong. My sister arrived late as usual, laughing too loudly, a glass already in her hand. She hugged everyone with the kind of ease that comes from never worrying about consequences. People gravitated toward her. They always had. She had a way of making problems sound like misunderstandings, debts like delays, promises like suggestions. I loved her, I always had, but loving her had cost me more than I realized. We ate, we laughed, we clinked glasses. My father cleared his throat. The room quieted in a way that felt rehearsed. He stood by the mantel, hands folded, eyes not quite meeting mine. My mother took a step closer to him, her smile fixed and careful, the way it got when she was about to say something she decided was for the good of the family. I felt a prickle at the base of my neck, a warning I ignored. "Tonight," my father said, "we want to talk about unity." Unity. The word hung there, heavy. I watched my sister's eyes flick to the floor, then back up, shimmering. My mother reached for her hand. "You know your sister has had a difficult year," my mother continued. "Business troubles, some obligations." She paused, letting the room lean in. "Families help each other. That's what we do." I nodded because nodding had become second nature. I waited for the ask, assuming it would be small, a loan, a cosign, a few months of support. I could handle that. I had handled so much already. Then my father said my name. He said it gently, like he always did when he wanted something. "You're responsible. You have a good job. You own your house." I felt the floor tilt. "We've talked," my mother said, still smiling, still performing, "and we think the best solution is for you to take care of your sister's debts. Not help, not assist, take care of." I laughed, a short sound that didn't belong to me. "What do you mean?" My sister started crying on cue, her tears sliding perfectly, her voice trembling as she spoke about pressure and fear and how she'd tried. She said numbers out loud, numbers that made my chest tighten. My father didn't correct her. My mother squeezed her hand harder. "You can sell your house," my mother said, as if she were suggesting I change a curtain. "You can move back here for a while. It's only fair." Only fair. The room buzzed with murmurs. Someone clinked ice in a glass. I felt heat crawl up my neck, my face burning as if I'd been slapped. I searched the room for a lifeline, a dissenting voice, but found none. I slid away from mine. This had been decided. This was an announcement, not a conversation. "I worked for that house," I said thinly. "I saved for years." "And we're proud of you," my father said quickly, the way people say they're sorry when they aren't. "That's why you can do this." I understood then what pride meant in this family. It meant being useful. It meant absorbing impact so others didn't have to. I excused myself to the bathroom and locked the door. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, eyes too bright, jaw clenched, shoulders pulled tight like a rope about to snap. I pressed my palms to the sink and breathed. I thought of the mornings I'd woken up early to work overtime, of the nights I'd skipped dinners out to save, of the day I signed the papers to my little house, the one with the creaky stairs and the sunlight that hit the kitchen just right at 4 in the afternoon. I thought of the quiet pride I'd felt unlocking my own front door. I thought of how easily they decided it wasn't really mine. When I returned, my sister hugged me, her tears damp against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, loud enough for others to hear. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled because everyone was watching. I smiled because that's what I'd always done. "We'll talk later," I said. But later never came. That night I drove home with the radio off, the city lights blurring into streaks. I sat in my car outside my house for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking of the engine as it cooled. The house looked the same as it had always had, modest, steady, mine. I went inside and stood in the doorway, taking in the familiar angles, the photos on the wall, the dent in the couch arm where I spilled coffee once and never fixed it. I felt something settle in my chest, not panic, not fear, resolute. They had asked me to disappear quietly into sacrifice. I decided I would disappear loudly into choice. I didn't sleep much that night. I paced. I made lists. I cried once, hard and fast, then stopped. In the morning, I called a realtor. I told her I wanted to sell quickly. She asked why. I said I was starting over. She understood more than she said. The weeks that followed moved in a strange blur. Open houses, paperwork, the careful detachment of strangers walking through my rooms, assessing value with their eyes. Each step felt like peeling off a layer of skin, but beneath it was something steadier. Every signature felt like a door closing and another opening. My parents called. My sister texted hearts and thank yous and reminders about deadlines. I answered less and less. When my mother asked when I'd move back home, I said I was figuring things out. When my father said he was proud of my maturity, I let the silence stretch. The day the sale closed, I held the check in my hands and felt an unexpected calm. It wasn't freedom yet, it was possibility. I packed only what mattered: clothes, photos, a few books. I left the keys on the counter and took a last look at the place where I'd learned what independence felt like. Then I locked the door and didn't look back. I didn't tell them where I was going. I didn't post updates. I didn't explain. I turned my phone off and drove until the city thinned and the road opened. I told myself I wasn't running away. I was choosing myself. For the first time, the choice felt like mine alone. And that was just the beginning. I crossed the city limits just as the sun was coming up, the sky a pale gray that promised nothing and everything at once. I drove with the window cracked, letting the cold air sting my face so I wouldn't drift into old thoughts. My phone stayed off on the passenger seat, dark and quiet, like a part of my life I'd set down on purpose. I had booked a small, furnished studio 2 towns over, nothing fancy, just a place with clean sheets and a lock that was mine. When I arrived, I carried my bags up 1 flight of stairs, unlocked the door, and stood in the middle of the room listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't home yet, but it was safe. That was enough. The first week passed slowly. Without the noise of family expectations, the days felt oddly spacious. I woke early out of habit, made coffee, and sat by the window watching people walk dogs, catch buses, live their ordinary lives. I started my job remotely from the small table by the window, grateful for the steadiness of it. At night, the quiet pressed in, and with it came the questions I'd postponed. Was I cruel? Selfish? Had I abandoned my parents? My sister? The word family kept knocking at the door of my thoughts, demanding entry. I reminded myself that family had asked me to trade my stability for someone else's recklessness. I reminded myself that love did not require self-erasure. When I finally turned my phone back on, the messages poured in. Missed calls from my mother, curt voicemails from my father, long texts from my sister that shifted between apology and expectation. "We need to finalize things," one read. "Deadlines are coming." I read them once, then again, and felt a strange distance, like I was reading about someone else's life. I typed a reply and deleted it. Then I typed another. Finally, I sent a single message. I've sold the house. I'm taking time to decide what I can and cannot do. Please don't contact me for a while. The response was immediate. Anger, confusion, guilt wrapped in concern. My mother wrote about shame, about what people would say. My father warned me not to be rash. My sister asked where I was, said she was scared. I turned the phone face down and let my hands rest on the table until the shaking stopped. Boundaries, I reminded myself, feel like cruelty to people who benefited from you having none. Weeks turned into a rhythm. I explored the neighborhood, found a small park with a bench under a jacaranda tree, joined a local gym where no one knew my name. I cooked simple meals, I slept better, and slowly something else surfaced beneath the relief. Grief. Grief for the version of family I'd hoped for, the one that celebrated without conditions. Grief for the sister I'd protected at the cost of myself. I let myself feel it, sitting on that park bench, watching purple petals fall like quiet confessions. One afternoon, my father showed up. I saw him through the cafe window first, standing stiffly on the sidewalk, scanning faces. My stomach dropped. I considered slipping out the back. Then I took a breath and stayed. When he walked in and spotted me, his shoulders sagged with something like relief. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and sat across from me, hands folded like they always were when he wanted control. "You worried us," he said. "I needed space," I replied. He sighed. "You can't just disappear. We're your family." I met his eyes. "Family doesn't demand a house as payment." He flinched. "Your sister is struggling." I said quietly, "She always is, and I've always paid." He leaned forward. "This isn't about payment. It's about responsibility." "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he talked about tradition, about sacrifice, about how things looked from the outside. I listened until he ran out of words. When he finally stopped, I told him about the nights I'd lain awake worrying about money while my sister booked trips she couldn't afford. I told him about the pride I'd swallowed to keep peace. I told him I loved them, but I would not give up my future to maintain a lie. When he left, he didn't hug me, but he didn't demand anything either. It was a start. The months that followed were not dramatic. They were honest. I sent my parents a modest amount from the sale, not the full ask, not the house's worth, but what I chose with a clear message that it was a one-time contribution. My sister protested, cried, accused. I didn't argue. I repeated myself. I held the line. I used the rest of the money to invest in myself. I took classes I'd postponed. I saved. I traveled a little, not far, just enough to feel the world widen. I learned what it felt like to make decisions without consulting fear. A year later, my sister called, her voice different, tired, real. She said she was working 2 jobs, that she'd sold things she loved, that she understood now. I listened. I didn't rescue her. I encouraged her. It felt like love without strings. On the anniversary of the party, I sat in my new apartment, larger than a studio, smaller than the house, just right. Sunlight hit the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, the same way it used to. I smiled at the coincidence and made tea. I thought about the woman who had nodded and smiled in that crowded living room, who had believed fairness meant obedience. I wish I could reach back through time and take her hand. I didn't disappear after all. I reappeared on my own terms. Choosing a life that fit didn't mean it stayed comfortable. There were moments, quiet, inconvenient moments, when doubt crept in and sat beside me like an old acquaintance, usually late at night, usually after family gatherings where laughter sounded just a little too practiced, where love was offered but not quite freely. I'd lie awake and wonder if I'd overcorrected, if independence had made me distant, if strength had turned me cold. Then something would happen to remind me why I'd chosen this path. It was my cousin's wedding, held in a large hall filled with white flowers and familiar faces. I almost didn't go. Big family events still carried echoes of that night, the party, the announcement, the way my life had been volunteered without my consent. But I went anyway, dressed simply, arriving on my own terms. I greeted relatives politely, kept conversations light, refused invasive questions with a practiced smile. Halfway through the evening, I overheard a conversation behind me, two aunts whispering, voices lowered but sharp. They talked about responsibility, about how some people forget where they come from, about how money changes people. I knew they were talking about me. Once that would have sent me spiraling, desperate to correct the story, to explain myself back into good standing. This time, I finished my drink, turned around, and met their eyes. "I didn't forget where I come from," I said calmly. "I just remembered where I'm going." They stared, startled. I excused myself and walked away, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something like pride. Growth, I realized, isn't always quiet. Sometimes it speaks up and leaves the room. My parents noticed the shift too. Over time, they stopped framing requests as expectations. When they asked for help, they asked, not assumed. When I said no, they didn't punish me with silence. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was healthier than anything we'd had before. I bought another place eventually, smaller than my first house, but brighter. It had a balcony where I drank coffee in the mornings and watched the city wake up. When I signed the papers, I didn't tell anyone right away. I sat alone in the empty living room, keys heavy in my palm, and let myself feel the full weight of what I'd rebuilt. Not just walls and floors, but trust in myself. I hosted my parents there months later. My mother ran her fingers along the shelves, asked careful questions. My father stood by the window, nodding slowly. When they left, my mother hugged me tightly. "You did this on your own," she said. There was no edge in her voice this time, just awe. That night, I cried, not from sadness, but from release. The truth settled into me fully then. I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd forced it to evolve. I'd shown them that love could exist without control, that support didn't require surrender. And in doing so, I changed not just my life, but the rules that came after me. If someone listening to this is standing where I once stood, cornered by expectations dressed up as duty, I want you to know this. Choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish, it makes you honest. And honesty, even when it costs you, always pays you back in the long run. I didn't disappear to punish anyone. I disappeared to save myself. And when I came back, I was finally someone worth saving. Saving myself didn't end the story. It changed the tone of it. After I bought my new place, something subtle shifted in how people spoke to me. Not kinder, not colder, just more careful. As if they were finally aware that I was no longer an extension of the family balance sheet, no longer the quiet solution waiting in the background. I had become separate. And separation, I learned, makes people reckon with their own choices. My sister struggled with that the most. She never asked me for money again, but she did something else instead. She asked for emotional access, constant updates, long messages late at night, confessions about how hard things were, how lonely she felt, how unfair life had become. None of it was manipulative in the obvious way. It was softer than that. But I recognized it for what it was, a new version of the same old pattern. If she couldn't take from my finances, she would take from my emotional reserves. One night, after a particularly long call where I listened for nearly an hour without saying much, she sighed and said, "I don't know how you do it. You're so strong." The old me would have absorbed that and offered reassurance. The new me paused. "I'm not strong because I carry everything," I said. "I'm strong because I don't anymore." There was silence on the line, then a quiet, "I don't know how to do that." "You learn," I said gently, "the same way I did, by being uncomfortable." It felt cruel as the words left my mouth. It also felt true, and I was done apologizing for truth. Not everyone adjusted. Some relatives drifted away, uncomfortable with the version of me that no longer played predictable roles. Others leaned in, curious, inspired, quietly asking how I'd managed it. I realized then that change is contagious, but only to those willing to catch it. Work became more than survival. It became expression. I mentored younger colleagues, especially women who apologized before speaking and volunteered for too much. I saw myself in them and gently interrupted the pattern. You don't have to earn rest, I'd say. You're allowed to say no. Watching their faces shift, confusion giving way to relief, felt like closing a circle I hadn't known was open. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a family dinner. Not a celebration, not an announcement, just dinner. I hesitated before accepting. When I arrived, there were no speeches, no expectations. We ate, talked about ordinary things, argued lightly about recipes. My father asked my opinion on a decision he was considering and waited, actually waited for my answer. My mother listened when I said I'd leave early. As I drove home that night, I realized something quietly extraordinary had happened. They had met me where I was, not where they wished I'd stayed. Healing, I learned, isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's showing up as yourself again and again until people adjust or fall away. Sometimes I think back to that party, the moment my life was offered up like a solution. I remember the heat in my face, the way the room closed in. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I wouldn't tell her to be brave. I'd tell her something simpler. You're allowed to leave. And I did. Not all at once, without grief, but with intention. And that made all the difference. Leaving taught me how to stay. With myself, with the truth, with discomfort when it showed up wearing familiar faces. But there was still one thing I hadn't done. One conversation I'd avoided because it felt heavier than the rest. It wasn't with my parents. It wasn't even with my sister. It was with myself, the part of me that still carried shame like a shadow, whispering that maybe I'd overreacted, maybe I'd broken something that didn't need breaking. That reckoning came unexpectedly. I was sorting through old emails one rainy afternoon when I found a draft I'd never sent, written the night after the party. It was addressed to my parents. I read it slowly, the words sharp with hurt, desperate to be understood. I talked about betrayal, about humiliation, about how small I'd felt when my life was reduced to a financial solution in front of relatives. I never sent it because I was afraid it would make things worse, afraid it would confirm their belief that I was emotional, dramatic, ungrateful. Reading it years later, my chest tightened, not with anger, but with tenderness. I saw myself clearly then, not weak, not dramatic, just wounded. And I realized I'd never fully forgiven myself for needing to leave so dramatically, for choosing disappearance when conversation felt impossible. So I wrote another letter. This one wasn't angry, it was honest. I told them I loved them. I told them how deeply that night had cut me, how it reshaped my understanding of my place in the family. I told them I wasn't writing to reopen wounds, but to close one. I sent it without expectations and sat with the discomfort that followed. Weeks passed before my father responded. His message was short. He said he'd read the letter twice. He said he hadn't understood the depth of my pain until now. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't ask for anything. He ended with, "I'm trying to do better." That was enough. Around the same time, something else shifted. I met someone, not in a dramatic way, no sparks in grocery aisles or destiny-laced coincidences. We met through friends, talked slowly, carefully. I told him about my family early on, about boundaries and why they mattered to me. He listened without trying to fix anything. When he asked questions, they were curious, not intrusive. It felt unfamiliar and safe all at once. Being loved without conditions was its own kind of healing. It showed me how warped my understanding of obligation had been, how often I'd mistaken endurance for devotion. With him, I learned that care could be mutual, that support didn't require collapse on either side. One evening, as we cooked dinner together in my bright little kitchen, he asked about the old house. I told him the story plainly, no bitterness, no defensiveness. When he finished, he said something that stayed with me. "You didn't lose a house, you bought yourself." I laughed, but my eyes filled. He was right. As years layered themselves quietly onto my life, I stopped measuring success by how useful I was to others. I measured it by peace, by how often I felt aligned instead of obligated, by how rarely I had to talk myself into staying. And then one final test arrived, one that would have broken the old me. My parents decided to downsize. They asked if I wanted to buy their house. The request landed gently, but its weight was unmistakable. Memories rushed in, expectations, roles. I took time to think. I walked through my apartment, touched the walls, looked out at the city I'd chosen, and when I answered, I did so calmly. "No," I said, "but I'm happy to help you find the right place." There was no argument, no guilt, just acceptance. That's when I knew the cycle had truly ended, not because they'd changed completely, but because I had. Knowing the cycle had ended didn't mean life stopped testing me. It meant the tests came quieter, more subtle, wrapped in ordinary moments instead of crises. The kind of moments where no one would blame you for slipping back into old habits. The kind where the line between kindness and self-betrayal is thin and easy to cross. I learned to watch that line carefully. When my sister announced she was moving to a smaller place and invited me to help her pack, I agreed, but with limits. I came for an afternoon, not a weekend. I helped sort, not decide. When she grew overwhelmed and started spiraling into familiar panic, I didn't take over. I sat with her until she found her footing again. She noticed. Later, she thanked me, not for rescuing her, but for trusting her to manage. That was new, for both of us. My parents began telling a different version of the story, too. When relatives asked about that time, my mother would say, "We asked too much of her." My father would add, "She taught us something important." Hearing that felt strange, like listening to a myth where you're the subject and the lesson. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The truth had already settled where it mattered. I noticed changes in myself as well. I stopped explaining my choices before anyone asked. I stopped filling silences with justification. When people were disappointed, I let them be. Disappointment, I learned, is survivable. Resentment is what kills relationships quietly over time. On my 40th birthday, I hosted a small dinner on my balcony. Close friends, soft music, candles flickering in the warm evening air. My family came, stayed, laughed, and left without incident. As I watched the city lights come on, I felt something I'd chased for years without naming it: ease. Not happiness that spikes and crashes, but a steady sense of rightness. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood alone and thought about legacy. Not the kind written in wills or property deeds, but the kind written in patterns. What would be passed down because of what I'd chosen? I realized then that I hadn't just changed my life, I'd interrupted a story. One where women proved their love by disappearing, one where responsibility flowed in only one direction. I didn't hate my family for teaching me that story. They'd inherited it too, but I was proud of myself for setting it down. Sometimes people ask if I regret selling the house. I tell them the truth. I regret that it ever felt necessary, but I don't regret choosing myself when no one else would. I don't regret walking away so I could walk back as someone whole. The house was bricks and paper and signatures. What I gained was something quieter and harder to explain, a life where love doesn't come with a bill attached. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this: disappearing was never the point. Becoming visible, to myself first, was. Visibility changes how you carry your past. It stops being a weight you drag behind you and becomes something you hold, carefully, consciously, choosing when to set it down. I didn't talk about that night much anymore, not because it hurt too much, but because it no longer defined me. Still, the memory stayed close, like a compass reminding me which direction I'd promised myself never to lose again. One afternoon, a younger cousin called me. She was nervous, voice shaky, asking if we could meet. We sat at a small cafe, the kind with chipped mugs and soft music. She stared at her hands for a long time before finally speaking. Her parents, she said, expected her to quit her job and move back home to help with finances. "They say it's temporary," she whispered. "They say it's what family does." I listened without interrupting. I heard my own past in her words, the same language, the same quiet pressure. When she finished, she looked at me with hope and fear tangled together. What should I do? I didn't tell her what to do. I told her what I'd learned. I told her that love doesn't demand invisibility, that help offered freely feels different from help extracted through guilt, that no one else gets to decide how much of your life you owe them. She nodded slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks, not because she had answers, but because she finally felt seen. After she left, I sat there longer than necessary, staring into my cooling coffee. It struck me then how stories move through families, passed hand to hand until someone stops them. I had stopped one, and now, quietly, others were noticing the gap it left. At work, I was asked to speak on a panel about leadership and resilience. I almost declined. Public vulnerability still made me uneasy, but I accepted, choosing honesty over comfort. When it was my turn, I talked about boundaries, not as walls, but as doors you control. I talked about how burnout often comes from being praised for endurance instead of balance. I watched heads nod, eyes soften. Afterward, several people approached me thanking me for saying what they hadn't known how to name. Driving home that night, I realized something simple and profound. The life I'd built didn't just protect me, it gave me language, and language, when shared, becomes permission. My relationship deepened too, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. We disagreed sometimes, we disappointed each other occasionally, but we talked, we repaired, we never kept score. I didn't have to disappear to be loved, and he didn't need me to disappear to feel secure. That alone felt revolutionary. On a quiet Sunday morning, I opened the small box where I'd kept the old house keys. I turned them over in my hands one last time, then placed them back and closed the lid. Not because I was done remembering, but because I was done needing the proof. The past no longer asked me anything, and that's how I knew I was free. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It settles in like a habit you didn't know you were allowed to form. By the time I noticed how natural my life felt, how little I braced myself before family interactions or difficult conversations, I realized I had crossed into something permanent. I wasn't maintaining boundaries anymore, I was living inside them. The real confirmation came during an ordinary moment. My sister called one afternoon, her voice steady. She told me she'd been offered a promotion, that she was scared to take it, that part of her wanted to sabotage it because success felt unfamiliar. I listened, smiled, and offered encouragement, but I didn't coach, didn't plan, didn't manage. When we hung up, I felt light. I hadn't been drained, I'd been present. That difference mattered. My parents aged quietly into a softer version of themselves, not perfect, not suddenly enlightened, but gentler. My mother stopped measuring love in sacrifice. My father learned to ask instead of assume. Sometimes they slipped. When they did, I named it calmly, and they corrected. Not because I demanded it, but because they knew now that access to me was earned through respect. One evening, I walked alone through a neighborhood of old houses, each with its own story humming beneath the paint. I stopped in front of one with a familiar layout, sunlight spilling through the front windows, and felt a flicker of recognition. Not longing, not regret, just acknowledgement. Houses hold memories. They don't hold destinies. I went home to my apartment, to the life I'd built deliberately, and cooked dinner slowly. As I ate, I thought about how differently everything could have gone, how easily I could have stayed, paid, shrunk, how praised I would have been for it, and how invisible. I used to think disappearing was the dramatic part of my story. Now I know it wasn't. The drama was in returning without apologizing for the space I'd taken, in staying visible when it would have been easier to fade back into usefulness. I learned that families don't fall apart because someone says no. They fall apart when everyone says yes to the wrong things for too long. Saying no saved us all, from resentment, from quiet bitterness, from a future built on imbalance. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Older, softer, steadier. I met my own eyes and felt a sense of recognition deeper than pride. I had kept my promise, and there was only one thing left to say. The last thing I needed to say wasn't to my parents or my sister or anyone who had once stood in that crowded living room while my life was volunteered on my behalf. It was to myself. I used to replay that night over and over, wondering what would have happened if I'd stood up, raised my voice, refused them right there in front of everyone. I imagined a stronger version of myself, one who didn't smile, didn't excuse herself politely, didn't go home shaking. For a long time, I believed that version would have been braver. Now I know better. Bravery doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience long enough to choose a cleaner exit. Sometimes it looks like silence that protects you until you're strong enough to speak without breaking. I didn't fail that night. I survived it. And survival was the first step toward change. If I could sit across from that woman now, the one in the blue dress, heart racing, realizing she'd been cornered, I wouldn't tell her to fight. I wouldn't tell her to forgive. I would tell her this. You don't owe anyone the rest of your life just because you handled the first part well. I would tell her that love built on obligation will always ask for more, that sacrifice without consent turns into resentment, that disappearing doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're listening to the part of you that knows staying would cost too much. Selling my house wasn't the end of my stability. It was the end of a story where my worth was measured by how much I could give away. Walking out wasn't abandonment. It was self-preservation. And coming back, on my own terms, was the most honest thing I'd ever done. Today, my life is quiet in the best possible way. I wake up without dread. I answer my phone without rehearsing defenses. I love my family without shrinking. I give when I choose, not when I'm cornered. And when I say yes, it's real. People still tell the story sometimes, about the party, about how I sold my house and disappeared. They say it like it's a mystery, like something reckless or extreme. I let them believe that if they want. But you know the truth now. I didn't disappear to punish anyone. I disappeared so I could finally hear myself think. And when I returned, I wasn't empty-handed. I brought boundaries. I brought clarity. I brought a life that fit me instead of consuming me. If you're listening to this and standing at the edge of a choice that scares you, one where saying no feels like betrayal, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to choose yourself, even if no one taught you how. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave the room. And sometimes that's exactly how you find your way home. I thought the story ended when I finally learned how to stay without shrinking. That would have been a neat ending. Clean, earned. But real life rarely stops where we want it to. It keeps unfolding, quietly testing whether the lessons we learned were temporary insights or permanent truths. Years passed, not in a montage way, in the slow accumulation of ordinary days, groceries, deadlines, birthdays, funerals, the small, unremarkable moments that actually decide who you are. My parents grew older in ways that were impossible to ignore. My mother's hands began to shake when she poured tea. My father repeated stories without realizing it. I noticed how they looked at me now, not with expectation, not with calculation, but with something closer to respect. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it, like sea glass worn smooth by time. One evening, my mother asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Do you think," she said slowly, "that if we'd asked differently, you would have stayed?" I didn't answer right away. I watched her trace the rim of her cup with her finger, waiting. "I think," I said finally, "if you'd asked instead of decided, I wouldn't have had to leave." She nodded, absorbing that. Then she surprised me. "I wish I had known that love wasn't supposed to feel like leverage." That sentence alone told me how far we'd come. My sister's life stabilized in ways that felt hard-won rather than handed to her. She married later than she'd planned, to someone steady who didn't mistake chaos for excitement. At her wedding, she pulled me aside and said, "I used to think you abandoned us. Now I know you showed us what adulthood actually looks like." It didn't erase the years of imbalance, but it reframed them. And reframing, I learned, is sometimes the only justice real life offers. I never bought another big house, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. My home stayed modest, intentional, filled with things chosen rather than inherited. Friends gathered there often, laughter came easily, silence did too. Both were welcome. Sometimes, late at night, I think about alternate versions of myself, the one who stayed and paid and lived in a childhood bedroom again, the one who was praised at every family gathering but quietly resented everyone she loved. That version still exists somewhere, I'm sure, but she's not me. What I learned, what I wish someone had told me earlier, is that families don't usually ask for everything all at once. They ask in increments, a little help, a small sacrifice, one exception, then another, and before you know it, your entire life is spoken for. The moment you stop complying feels dramatic only because the erosion happened quietly. That party wasn't the betrayal, it was the reveal. And selling my house wasn't the rebellion, it was the boundary made visible. I tell this story now, not because I'm angry and not because I want sympathy. I tell it because someone listening right now is sitting in a room where their future is being discussed as if they aren't in it. Someone is being praised for being the strong one while being positioned as the solution. If that's you, hear this clearly. Strength is not an obligation contract. Responsibility does not mean self-erasure, and love that survives only when you bleed for it is not love, it's dependency wearing a familiar face. I didn't disappear to make a point. I disappeared because staying would have cost me myself. And when I came back, I didn't bring money or property or apologies. I brought a boundary. That boundary changed everything. And it can change things for you, too. After everything I'd lived, everything I learned, I thought there would come a day when the story would finally feel finished. Not complete in a dramatic sense, but settled, like a book returned to the shelf. Instead, I discovered something quieter and more humbling. Stories like mine don't end, they echo. The echo showed up in small, unexpected ways. A coworker confided that her parents expected her to take out a loan for her brother's failed business. A neighbor admitted she'd been paying her adult son's rent while quietly draining her savings. A friend whispered over dinner that she was exhausted from being the reliable one in her family, but didn't know how to stop. Each time I listened, I didn't preach, I didn't tell them what to do, I just told them what it cost me to say yes for too long and what it gave me to finally say no. I saw the relief in their faces, the way validation alone loosened something tight inside them. It made me realize how rarely we hear stories about choosing yourself without turning into the villain, how often self-preservation is framed as abandonment, especially when it's a woman doing the choosing. I started volunteering with a local mentorship group, working with young adults navigating family pressure, finances, and first careers. They reminded me so much of myself, earnest, capable, and already tired. When they asked how to balance obligation and independence, I told them the truth. There's no balance when one side keeps taking, there's only adjustment, and adjustment starts with honesty. One evening, after a long session, I walked home feeling heavy in the good way, like something meaningful had been carried, not stolen. I realized then that my story had outgrown me. It wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a bridge, something others could cross when they didn't yet know how. My parents attended one of my talks later that year. They sat in the back, quiet. Afterward, my father hugged me, really hugged me, and said, "I'm glad you didn't listen to us." I laughed through tears. Me too. We never spoke of the house again, not because it was forbidden, but because it had lost its power. It had been a chapter, not a verdict. As I grew older, the urgency softened. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices or defend my boundaries. They existed, solid and unremarkable, like a fence you stop noticing once it's been there long enough. People learned where the gate was. Some never tried to open it again. That was fine. What stayed with me most was the understanding that love doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to arrive fully, honestly, without pretending you're smaller than you are. I didn't sell my house because I was reckless. I sold it because I was done negotiating my worth in rooms where I wasn't allowed to speak. I didn't disappear because I was weak. I needed space to become strong without an audience. And when I came back, slowly, deliberately, I didn't come back empty. I came back whole. If this story stays with you, let it be for this reason. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep anyone else warm. Not your parents, not your siblings, not the people who call your sacrifice love because it's convenient for them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved is to step away, not forever, just long enough to remember who you are.